education and through advocacy. We help with voter registration, we organize forums for candidates running for public office, and we give presentations such as this on ballot propositions, among many other things. So, our goal today is to present unbiased information on the state ballot propositions and County Measure W. We're here to give you tools that you need to examine the propositions on the ballot, to explain what the propositions say, and to tell you what the people supporting and opposing each proposition says. We're not judging the merits of the arguments or guaranteeing that any of those arguments are valid. It's just what the supporters and the opponents are saying. So, on the handout you can get on your way out, there's how to evaluate ballot propositions, and there's some important tools to have you think about when you're wondering whether to vote yes or no. Examine what the measure seeks to accomplish. Do you agree with these goals? Is the measure well written? Will it wind up in court to be settled? Does the measure mandate a government program or service without addressing how it's going to be funded? And a big one for me is be wary of distortion tactics in commercials that rely on image but tell nothing of substance about the measure. There's no truth in advertising in politics. So if it says, if you vote for this, puppies are going to die, you might want to dig a little deeper. So, also, just quickly, propositions are put on the ballot either by the state legislature or by citizens who gathered enough signatures in support. That's called an initiative. And the propositions can either make new laws, change existing laws, change California's constitution, or authorize bonds for specific uses. And proposition only needs a 50% yes vote to pass. So, Measure W, that's just a San Mateo County wide measure. I'll be doing the first four. They're all bond authorization propositions, so I'm going to say a little bit about bonds. Bonds are the way that the government funds very large, very costly projects. So there are two kinds of bonds. One is a revenue bond, and that's paid for by revenues that are created by the project, such as a toll bridge. The other is a general obligation bond, and that's sold to investors, and it's repaid out of the state general fund. So currently, California has about $83 billion of general obligation bonds, and $39 billion of those have not yet been sold. So the state is currently making principal and interest payments of about $6 billion annually. And to get an idea of how that works with our overall budget, our debt service ratio is now a little above 4%. 5% is considered a general rule of thumb. You don't want to go over 5%. So if none of these bonds are approved, our debt service ratio will climb to 4.5% by 2022. If all three of these bond propositions on this ballot are approved, the debt service ratio will increase by less than half of 1%, less than half of 1%. So I'm going to do the first four propositions, and I'll take questions after I do all four of them. And we'll use that format to maybe expedite things. This first proposition is a legislative statute. It was put on the ballot by the legislature. The question is, should the state issue $4 billion in general obligation bonds for housing programs for low-income residents, veterans, farm workers, and also for mobile homes and transit-oriented housing? So a little background, about 100,000 houses and apartments are constructed each year in California, most by private interests and not by the government. So in some instances, the state provides assistance with grants or low-cost loans for construction of housing to be sold or rented to low-income individuals. The state also receives about $2 billion a year from the federal government to support housing projects. So this proposal is $4 billion to be spent on these housing programs. $1.8 billion for rebuilding or renovating affordable multifamily housing, such as apartments. $450 million for infrastructure, including parks, water, sewage, and transportation to support the housing construction. $450 million for down payment assistance to low and moderate income homeowners. and $300 million for farm worker housing, both rental and owner-occupied, and $1 billion for home loans to eligible veterans. So this would provide assistance to 30,000 multifamily and 7,500 farm worker households. It would provide down payment assistance to about 15,000 home buyers, and as well as home loans to about 3,000 veterans. The fiscal effects, the cost to the taxpayers would be about $5.9 billion over a 35-year period, or approximately $170 million per year for both the principal and the interest. And that comes out of the general fund. The $1 billion set aside for the veterans assistance will be repaid by the veterans when they pay their mortgage payments. So supporters say Proposition 1 will provide relief from the housing crisis by building housing and helping those who struggle to buy housing. It honors veterans by helping them to buy a home. It will increase the number of construction jobs. But opponents say Prop 1 will help a very limited number of people. Californians are being asked to borrow more money for these bonds, which ends up costing everyone. And it doesn't solve the real cause of the housing shortage, which is restrictive zoning and construction regulations. There are about 570 organizations and 38 appointed and elected officials that support this. There's a coalition of groups supporting both Propositions 1 and 2. And primary funding has come from the Chan Zuckerberg Advocacy and KP Financial Services. Both have given $250,000. Then various housing associations and trusts and building and construction trades have each contributed around $100,000. Many cities support this, including Redwood City. Again, various veterans associations and trades groups and housing organizations. The opponents haven't raised any money, and Gary Wesley, an attorney, has written the ballot argument against this proposition. So, again, a yes vote means that the state will sell $4 billion in general obligation bonds to fund various affordable housing projects and veterans' home loans. A no vote means the state should not sell $4 billion in general obligation bonds. Go to Prop 2 is another legislative statute put on the ballot by the state legislature. And the question on this one is, should $2 billion in bonds be issued and the Mental Health Services Act be amended to fund the No Place Like Home program? So a little background on this one. Some of you may remember back in 2004, we approved Proposition 63. It's called the Mental Health Services Act. It increased income tax paid by people with an income over $1 million. And it's provided funding for county mental health services. Counties are the ones that are responsible for providing mental health care to people who don't have private insurance. So in 2016, the state legislature passed the No Place Like Home Act to provide $2 billion in bonds for use by counties for housing people who are eligible for treatment under Proposition 63. The bonds were to be paid off by the revenue from Prop 63. So that would make it a revenue bond. The constitutionality of using Prop 63 funds for housing was called into question, so the bonds were never issued. And the court is still pending on that, the decision is pending. So this proposal, Prop 2, would approve the No Place Like Home Act and approves the issuance of $2 billion in bonds to support the program. It also amends the provisions of Prop 63 to allow use of the revenue for the No Place Like Home Act. The Legislative Analyst's Office estimates that these awards probably would fund roughly 20,000 supportive housing units. No more than $140 million each year can be used for this program. So the fiscal effects, no direct fiscal effects since the bonds would be paid back from funds that already are being generated by Prop 63. And to give you an idea, Prop 63 is bringing in a pretty wide range, between $1.5 and $2.5 billion a year. So it's estimated that the bond would be paid off in 30 years at 4.2% interest, which would be approximately $120 million a year, which is under that $140 million cap that's written into the proposition. So supporters say this proposition will alleviate the problem of homelessness complicated by mental illness. Supportive housing allows coordinated care of individuals who need treatment and housing stability. And there's an error in this slide. The first opponent is actually a supporter. This uses funds already earmarked for mental health services. So opponents say this sends Prop 63 money on buildings instead of badly needed mental health treatments, and counties already use Prop 63 revenue to offer housing to severely mentally ill patients, and restrictive zoning laws that make it difficult to build housing is not addressed. So the supporters raised $4.1 million. There are 168 organizations and 6 elected and appointed officials that support this. They're the California Police Chiefs and Firefighters Association, mental health councils and associations in many cities and counties. There's one opponent, that's the Orange County Register, and there have been no contributions in opposition to this. The funding is the same as with one, since it's this coalition of Yes on 1 and 2. So again, Chan Zuckerberg Advocacy and KP Financial each gave $250,000, and the coalition of groups give around $100,000 each. So a yes vote means that the provisions of Proposition 63 will be amended to allow the use of the revenue for No Place Like Home Act, and that the state will issue $2 billion in bonds to be paid back by Proposition 63 funds. And a no vote means the revenue from Prop 63 may not be used to pay off bonds from No Place Like Home. So Proposition 3, again, bonds, but it was put, it's an initiative statute, so it was put on the ballot by a group that got enough citizens, registered citizens to sign for it. So the question is, should the state sell $8.9 billion in bonds to fund projects related to water supply and quality, watershed and fisheries restoration, habitat protection, water conveyance, and groundwater sustainability and storage? So a little background, California's water amount and location varies widely from year to year. We have polluted water, we have flooding, we have shortages. Various government agencies spend about $30 billion a year in the water sector. Over 3/4 of that is largely paid for by individual ratepayers for water and sewage treatment plants and cleanup of the stormwater run. In the last 17 years, voters have approved $51 billion in general obligation bonds for various natural resource projects. The state has several $1 billion available from those measures to be used for water quality supply and infrastructure. So the proposal would authorize $8.9 billion in bonds for various water-related programs and projects, including $2.5 billion for watershed lands improvement, $2.1 billion for water supply and quality, $1.4 billion for fish and wildlife habitat, $1.2 billion for water facility upgrades for specific projects in the Central Valley, the Bay Area, and also for Oroville Dam, and $500 million for flood protection. It would also give a portion of the revenue from the sale of cap and trade permits to 4 water delivery entities. Most of the funds will be distributed as grants to agencies that must provide equal matching funds. It provides reduced cost-sharing requirements for projects benefiting disadvantaged communities. So the fiscal effects, it would be $17.3 billion repaid over 40 years, or $430 million a year, which is about 1/3% of the general fund. Local governments may save money because grants reduces the grants reduce their share of the cost of a project. However, a project could increase their future spending, such as a new desalination facility that they have to maintain. So annual net effect on local governments and ratepayers is likely to be small. Supporters say Prop 3 will fund projects to help increase water supply from a variety of sources such as stormwater capture and desalination. It will help ensure that disadvantaged communities can access safe drinking water. And watershed restoration will improve water quality and protect agricultural interests. But opponents say we need more dams to collect rain and snowmelt from the Sierras. Prop 3 provides no money for new dams. It panders to special interests by making recreation wildlife a priority over farmers. Paying back these new bonds will result in raised taxes. And this proposition shifts the cost for water from the end users to California taxpayers. So the supporters, there are 416 organizations and 19 officials that support this. Got about $4.9 million in contributions from the Californians for Safe Drinking Water, Clean and Reliable Water Supply Coalition of the California Waterfowl Association, $575,000, Ducks Unlimited, California Wildlife Foundation, and Western Growers, various agriculture groups. Opponents have not raised any money in opposition, and I have Central Solano Citizens Taxpayer Group that's opposing this. So a yes vote means the state will sell $8.9 billion in bonds to fund projects related to water supply and quality, watershed and fisheries restoration, habitat protection, water conveyance, and groundwater sustainability and storage. No vote, the state will not sell $8.9 billion in bonds to fund these projects. And Proposition 4, that's also an initiative statute on the ballot by citizens. Should the state issue $1.5 billion in general obligation bonds to expand and improve the buildings and equipment at children's hospitals? So there are 8 private nonprofit hospitals, 5 University of California children's hospitals, and more than 100 other nonprofit hospitals that serve children with complex chronic health conditions eligible for the California Children's Services Program. Over half the patients receive Medi-Cal benefits. Only a small amount of funding remains from previous bonds that have been sold to support hospitals, and they're expected to be used up by now. So this proposal would raise $1.5 billion through the sale of general obligation bonds, use the funds to improve and expand children's hospitals. The money could be used to build new facilities, to improve and expand current facilities, and to purchase new equipment. The 8 private nonprofit hospitals, children's hospitals, would be eligible for 72% of the funds. The rest of the funds would go to University of California Children's Acute Care Centers and to nonprofit hospitals that care for children eligible for governmental programs. The fiscal effects, the state would need to repay a total of $2.9 billion. The $2.9 billion is made up of the original $1.5 billion bond, and that would be $1.4 billion in interest to be paid back over 35 years. So the yearly repayment amount is about $80 million. Supporters say Prop 4 helps over 2 million sick children each year and leads to better health outcomes. Previous bonds have been used to add more beds and purchase new technology. This bond would be for infrastructure improvements. It would be investing $40 per year per patient and has nothing to do with taxes. Opponents say the bond would need to be repaid potentially through higher taxes. We should first look at improving that entire healthcare system, including lower costs. Public funds should never be used for private facilities. And the supporters are about 60 organizations and 7 officials that support this. Children's hospitals and the children's hospitals have $10.9 million and 8 private hospitals have contributed $1.4 million. Opponents, San Diego Union Tribune and the Orange County Register, and again, Gary Wesley wrote the argument in the ballot against. So a yes vote means the state will issue $1.5 billion in general obligation bonds to expand and improve the buildings and equipment at children's hospitals. A no vote, the state will not issue $1.5 billion in bonds to fund these projects. Okay, I hope you kept notes of questions you wanted to ask in the previous months. Are there any questions on 1 through 4? Yes?
Can you describe the Silicon Valley Leadership Group? Who are they?
They're the big
companies in Silicon Valley. The head of it is Carl Guardino, and so it's significant that they approve that they support it. Because they're, and you can look up like sglg.org, I think. And the reason I know this is that I've been working on single-payer healthcare for 20 years, and they have never supported single-payer healthcare. But
And they're
supporting that.
I'm sorry, and they're supporting Prop 4.
I don't think that, no, it was one that said Silicon Valley. Was it one or two? I think it was two.
Okay, sorry. Well, thank you. Any other questions you can answer for me? In the back, Inspector.
What hospitals in the Bay Area would be eligible for these grants?
Well, USF and the Chan Zuckerberg, I think their children, definitely Benioff's Children's Hospital.
Packard.
Yeah, Packard
is private.
I'm sorry?
Packard is private.
Yes, private.
Non-profit.
Yeah, I think it covers all of them.
Yeah, and that's one of the opposition's things again. This is that public funds shouldn't be spent on private. So it's definitely going to private.
Even though
they're not-profit, and they're private. Another question?
Lisa, do we know what low income is considered?
Yeah, I should have written that down. I was asked before. It's based on the calculations on the percentage of the general
federal poverty level.
Yeah, federal poverty level. But it also covers middle income too. So that's it.
The Prop 1, where it talks about all this housing, what's the oversight for who picks where the houses are built or whatever?
The oversight of how the money's spent.
Yeah.
I think it would just be the government that's issuing the
You didn't say how, you said where. The question is who decides where they're going to be.
Well, what does it say?
Who's deciding where these things are
Yeah,
built?
The legislation.
right, our state government that oversees the budget.
Because they have to apply with a grant, and grants are subject to acceptance or not, design.
Yeah.
You had said something about on the mentally ill one, Prop 2, something about no action in the courts. Was that from the NL, the earlier one, or
Right. The No Place Like Home Act provided for money from Prop 63 to pay back the bonds they wanted to issue, but someone questioned if under Prop 63 those funds could actually be used for housing. It should just be used for treatment. So it's in the courts, but it's pending. It hasn't been decided yet. And so they're hoping to supersede that by getting this passed. Yes?
As part of that same proposition too, I was confused reading the information about the housing piece. That what's being proposed seems to be shifting money from county work to supply housing, but at the same time the counties are saying, oh wait a minute, we already do that. So I don't know if it's a shift of oversight. Why would we shift these monies from the counties to the state if it's already being serviced at the county level?
Well, because the counties are having trouble paying for it all because mental health is becoming such a huge issue, especially the homeless. So there'd be a bit of a wash in that, yes, the counties try to find housing for mentally ill people that don't have housing. So they already try to supply that, but it's costly in this area and California. And so 63 would give them more funds to provide affordable housing for mentally ill people. So the Prop 63 money is state money, and they currently have more than they're spending. 1.5 to 2.5 billion a year is more than they need for treatment. So they're saying take some of that money and actually house these people, and maybe they won't need as much treatment.
And they're saying, having the housing near where the treatment is also important, because a lot of these people don't drive or whatever, and then, or the service providers don't have to spend time going there. And I think some of the opposition to this is partly because mental illness is often comorbid with substance abuse and things like that. And there are some people who say substance abuse is not mental illness, it should only go to people with labels like schizophrenia, not with substance abuse issues.
And I think we better move on because there are a whole lot more
I want to make a
propositions.
comment because I work with the homeless. Number one, at press time, there was no opposition to that. I have physically seen severely mentally ill people in Palo Alto get housing in Sunnyvale. They created Parkside Studios, one and two bedroom. This young man is, and he was in his car for 10 years. Getting that apartment, although it took him a while to get used to it mentally, he is a totally different person. It really shows, even a person who's very mentally ill, that what they do is they put them in these apartments and do wraparound services. Make sure they get furniture and mental health coverage. And I've witnessed how phenomenal it is.
Difference that makes in people's lives, yeah. So this would be money to pay that, but the money's already there, just shifting its use. Are you next?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Are you gonna take one more question or not? What is it? Maybe I'll answer. Go ahead.
I have a question on Prop 3. And I read that this Sierra Club is opposed to that. And one of their oppositions is the use of the greenhouse gas funds. Yeah, the cap and trade, thank you. Is being used for that. And I don't understand what's being proposed in this proposition has to do with greenhouse gases and why it would be funded from the cap and trade.
Do you have a good short answer to that, Lisa?
Yeah, just quickly, it's complicated. It's, water is used to generate electricity, and they've got to pay for the electricity that they're using, and so that's where the cap and trade is the greenhouse gas emissions to generating the electricity. So they would get some of the money back for that. There's I would say votersedge.org, and go to type in your ballot, your address, and your ballot will come up, and you can click on information on all the candidates and the propositions. And the league has a really good description and their pros and cons of that. It might help answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, now to step away from bonds, but we're still talking about housing, right? This is Prop 5. I imagine we all remember Prop 13, back in the 70s, basically, would be how the assessment of your house works for property tax purposes. Is this microphone working for you guys?
Yeah.
I mean, I can hear it, but is it too tinny? Oh. Sounds funny to me, so if you guys are okay, it's fine. So this is actually a constitutional amendment, so that is something that one has to think carefully about, because once it's done by the voters, then it can only be undone by the voters again, or adjusted. And so what Prop 5 proposes to do is to amend the Constitution to change part of Prop 13, and basically to allow some increased exemptions. Basically, at the moment, people who are 55 or older have a severe disability, and or are in a disaster zone, like the Santa Rosa fires, have a tax benefit in property taxes in that they can leave their house, sell it, and go to another house and not necessarily one for one, but have what is a reduced assessment compared to what it would be. But they have to do this within 2 years of selling the house, and they have to do it either within the county they currently live in or one of 10 counties that has agreements for inter-county transfers, and that can be done once in a lifetime. And basically, this proposition would expand that so that you could go anywhere in California, you can do it multiple times, and at the moment, I guess you can't buy a more expensive house and have a basis adjustment. And if Prop 5 passes, that same group of people, it's still only the over 55 and or disabled and or disaster zone. We are not going to walk through that example. Okay, the arguments for and against it. Local governments get money from property taxes, and much of that property tax money goes to schools. So there would be a reduction in property taxes. Basically, that goes to local government and schools because more exemptions would be created, people paying less. And they say there could be a small fiscal impact from the fact that there may be more property changing hands. There's a county transfer tax, and that might be a wash, more paperwork, more money, or it might be a small positive amount. But the big numbers are about 100 million per year up to $1 billion not going into local coffers, and that might be offset by state funding, but if it's state funding, then it has to come from somewhere else, or the state has to get more money to replace it. The arguments in favor are, people in those categories need more protection. More houses will, turn over because people will not feel like they have to stay in their house for tax reasons. So then young people can move in and buy them. And, Prop 13 was enacted to, have tax savings, and this is a follow-on of it that is consistent with the initial intent. The opponents say basically we're going to lose a lot of money for local schools and services, and these people already have Prop 13 protection. This is just enlarging the amount of protection they would have. And so about 13 million from realtors associations and also some real estate investment trusts, publicly traded groups of like apartment complexes. And the opponents are the service employees and the teachers. Impacted? Yes or no? Change Prop 13 or no? Should I take questions on that now? The bonds are all sort of consistent with each other. We have some very different topics. You were first on the left, my left.
I don't understand what it is that this amendment would change.
It expands certain possibilities for selling your house and not having to pay market value property tax rates on a new
Give an
purchase.
example of something that would be true only under this amendment.
Under this amendment, well, the amendment expands it so that if, say, San Mateo County does not have an agreement with Fresno County and you want to sell a house here, move to Fresno County because it's cheaper, you could not do that unless this proposition is passed and have those tax savings. You can obviously buy and sell anything you want, but...
Okay, so it allows you to buy another home in any county in California and get this. What about if you buy a more expensive place? If I sell my $2 million teardown and move into a $2.5 million ultra luxury studio apartment,
there will be an adjustment of some kind. You will pay less tax than you would otherwise if you did not, if Props 5 were not passed, or if you were not a senior or whatever.
Do you know why SEIU and CTA don't like that?
I can imagine that the teachers don't like it because of money being diverted from the schools, and that service employees, I think, they work in the cafeterias and other things perhaps associated with schools. Lisa?
And one other thing it changes is you can do that as many times as you want. Currently, you can only do it once, and now you can move as many times as you want and take your property tax with you.
Right, yeah. You asked for an example, but there are multiple steps up. You're right, Lisa. You were first.
So you said one of the assumptions was it would free up housing so young people could buy houses?
That is what some of the supporters say.
That's nuts.
If a senior moves out of that house, then you have more houses ordered.
Right, I heard that word, capital gains, yes. This does not address capital gains. It's only the property tax part. We have one more? In front?
Well, I don't know, I think that it kind of hurts cities that aren't as wealthy as others. For instance, Menlo Park, Redwood City, San Carlos. I live in Redwood City, and when the GAN Act passed, I was lucky to get into that. But I can see how the Redwood City schools kind of suffer more because they don't have as much money coming in. And they also don't have as much parental support and money from, I'm sorry.
Right, the parental support is not addressed by this, but the concept of, yes, is there going to be more or less readily available money for schools and local services? So, that?
Is there any estimate about how much the schools will lose?
Yeah, about 100 million in the first year, going up to $1 billion after a number of years. Yes.
For the whole...
For the state of California, yes.
But they get funds from Prop 98.
I don't know about Prop 98. Anyway, once again, votersedge.org, and actually the sample ballot and the thing from the Secretary of State are very informative. And I can hang out and answer additional questions later, but I guess for the rest of you, we're running late. Okay, Prop 6. This, another one to kind of pay attention to. It's complicated in the sense that essentially yes means no and no means yes. Last year, the legislature passed a gas tax and some other vehicle-related fees, a tax on electric cars and things like that because they don't use gas. And this money is intended to bring in about $6 billion in this fiscal year and up to $12 billion in a few other years. And then basically these monies are set aside for transportation-related projects. And transportation is not only roadways. In this case, it includes public transit, bridges, ferries, bicycle, pedestrian things. And I believe some of the light rail is allowed in it. And basically, in June we had Prop 69, which in essence said, we know you people are trying to repeal the gas tax. We want to sort of head it off and not have you repeal it. We promise these monies will be used for transportation-related things. We won't lend them to the general fund and so on. That passed, but we also still have this ballot initiative, so it did not serve to head it off. So what this means is we want to repeal, in essence, what the legislature did which was to put on fuel taxes, vehicle taxes, in order to fund transportation projects. And since that passed, previously, counties and entities have already started undertaking transportation-related projects, where they get the grants or matching monies from the state. So it is possible that projects already started would either have to be stopped or the money would have to come from somewhere else. And an additional feature of this Prop 6, it would amend the state constitution so that any future vehicle taxes would have to be voted on by the voters, not the legislature, which at the moment, with a 2/3 majority, can enact taxes like that. And so again, once something like that is put into law, the only way to change it or remove it is to bring it back to the ballot. So basically, this is money that is meant to go to fix, roads, potholes, and congestion. If it passes, then billions of dollars that we have been thinking of investing in transportation and infrastructure will not be available. And also in the future, we will have to come to the legislature will have to come to the voters to raise fuel taxes. The supporters say, we already pay way too much in these things, taxes and whatnot, and basically it's such an important part of people's lives, it should be something that they vote on, whether there are fuel taxes or not, or how much they go up. And they say 1/3 of the tax increase will be diverted to, their words, non-road related pet projects. I interpret that to mean, yes, literally non-road, but that is still transportation. Like I said, ferries, bike lanes, connecting counties better over the county lines. And, okay, I guess I said already, tax increases are so important. People should do it themselves, vote on it. And the opponents say, we got a big road problem, transit, traffic. We need things fixed. It's a dire situation, and we got to do something about it. 5.3 million in contributions from the California Republican Party and certain Republican candidates. The opponents have about 34 million under the California Alliance for Jobs and some building and trades groups that likely will benefit from construction projects. So that's that. Okay, this is more complicated, yes or no. In essence, a yes vote means take away the existing gas tax. A no vote means keep the existing tax in place. Clear as mud? Front?
The Republican Party was successful in Southern California of unseating recalling Josh Newman, who was a very progressive Democrat, because he voted for the tax. And they got enough signatures that the repeal, this was in June, the primary, they successfully got rid of him because of his vote on him.
So this is a polarizing issue. We'll see about Prop 7. Maybe that's not so polarizing. And time for a little levity here. Okay. Once upon a time, we had this project called Daylight Saving Time. And it's been around since World War II, I guess. And we're used to it. There are a couple of states that don't change time. They have standard time all the time. Hawaii and Arizona, and essentially there are people who put this on the ballot to say this changing of the time twice a year is traumatic. People have more heart attacks. It's costly in that sense. We don't actually save electricity. We spend more with the shift. Kids get hit, walking to school, and we should not be changing time twice a year. And I don't know quite why, it's actually a two-part thing. We could do standard time all year round, as fast as the legislature can go. But if we want it year-round, it actually has to be approved by Congress and the president. So somebody asked before, why is California doing it this complicated way if we could just do it? The only answer I have is we're California, right? We have to be different or complicated. There's no major monetary impact, not on the level of bonds and things. And it will be safer if we do this, say the proponents, and we actually use electricity, not save it with daylight saving shifts. The opponents say we tried this once and people hated it, and these studies about shifting are inconclusive. No money has changed hands on this. There are some state legislators who are both for and against it. Change? Don't change.
Wait a minute.
Vote for that one.
Does this make daylight savings time year-round?
It doesn't do anything yet. It advises the California State Legislature to consider having year-round daylight saving time.
And if they did, then California would be different from every other state.
No.
And that is correct, it would be different, but even if the legislature studies it and decides they would like to do it, they can't actually implement it without Congress and the president agreeing.
It's probably not going to happen anytime soon.
Florida has already passed this, so they're.
And so it would be, winter sunrise would be later.
Yes.
Yeah, everything would be shifted, but there's still 24 hours in a day, and there's still X number of hours of daylight and dark, whatever time you call it.
And if you recall in the 70s and the gas crisis, the federal government said everybody's going to be on daylight savings all year round, and everybody hated it because the kids were going to school in the dark and it was bad. But the whole country did it at that time because of the energy crisis.
But it also depends on what latitude you are, whether you're going to school in the dark or not. I grew up in Vermont. It's, more like Washington, It's going to be dark whatever time it is. And, oops. I'm going backwards. Okay, Proposition 8, dialysis clinics. We have dialysis clinics, lots and lots of people get dialysis. A majority of them are on Medicare or Medi-Cal. There are two large private companies, DaVita and Fresenius, who operate most of the dialysis clinics in California. Anyway, it's paid either by the government or by private insurance, and those, of course, sometimes have differential rates. Prop 8 wants to, in essence, regulate the pricing of the dialysis clinics. And they're figuring out some cap that's the most that they should be able to charge. And they're supposed to then do something with the money to improve patient care instead of paying back insurance companies. So basically, it's a somewhat small fiscal impact compared to big bond measures and things, a few $1 million. It's also uncertain how the companies will respond, if they will either pull out of certain locations or it could be the money impact could vary depending on basically what are the appropriate costs, or what are considered or legislated as the appropriate costs. And if the clinics think they can't make a reasonable rate of return, they can essentially sue to change the cap number. As the supporters say, this will give an incentive for dialysis clinics to lower costs and improve patient care, and the overall cost of insurance will decrease for everyone if insurance companies are charged less. Again, these are the words of the supporters and or opponents when I get to that. These are not my words, the League's words, and we haven't vetted them for their truth. We've got enough else to do. The opponents say this is arbitrary. It might not cover the cost of running a clinic, and then clinics will close or reduce operations, and we'll get the opposite of the intended effect. 20 million from Californians for Kidney Dialysis Patient Protection, i.e. the people who service them. 73 million from patients and caregivers to protect dialysis patients, a group that is largely composed of dialysis providers. So, rebate money to dialysis clinics if they charge too much. Dialysis clinics required to rebate if they charge whatever this number is decided to be, or status quo.
Who has oversight on this? Who sets the rate?
The rate, or the Medicare or Medi-Cal rate is obviously some government entity.
Mostly those two.
It's mostly those two, and then I am not sure who is going to have oversight or decision-making power for this if Prop 8 actually passes. But Ellen is going to come up and talk about some other propositions, and I can research that for you in the meanwhile. Anything else?
Who's paying for all those TV ads I see on Proposition 8?
No.
I haven't actually seen them. You got to look at that fine print in the bottom, right? What's it?
No,
Yeah.
but by a dialysis patient that says his life will be threatened.
Right.
Ellen, do you want to come up and do 10?
Yep.
Pass off the hat.
Okay, Proposition 10 has to do with rent control. You've probably heard about this one as well. Get my script here. So the way it is now, about 30 years ago, there were 14 cities that decided to institute rent control. And that would regulate how much and how often a landlord could raise the rent on his existing tenants. In 1995, the state adopted something called the, here we go. Oops, wrong way, sorry. Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. And this limited rent control to buildings that were first rented out before 1995. It limited rent control on single-family homes. It allowed landlords to raise rent to a market rate if the tenant moved, once the tenant moved out. Renters in California, with these, we're pretty much aware of this, we pay 50% more than the national average. About 20% of Californians live in cities with rent control, and there are more cities now that are looking to establish rent control. So what Prop 10 would do, it would repeal Costa-Hawkins. It would allow cities and counties to regulate rents for any kind of housing, no matter when it was built or what kind of building it was, single-family homes included. It doesn't change existing rent control laws, and it doesn't create rent control laws. This allows the cities and municipalities to do what they feel is appropriate for their areas. The proposition keeps the landlord's right to a fair rate of return on their investment. So the fiscal impact is hard to know. If rent control It would depend on the content of any rent control ordinances that cities adopt and on how the landlords and the tenants react to those ordinances. If rent control is expanded, it's likely that landlords will reduce the amount of rental units that are offered. The value of rental housing then would decrease. Some renters will pay less for rent, and landlords would have less income from renting their places. So this will have an effect on property taxes, sales taxes, and income tax revenues. If a landlord is making less money because he can't bring in as much, he's going to pay less in income tax. Overall, the impact on state and local governments will be reduced revenue in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars each year, and the losses could be less or more. So we really don't have any idea what kind of fiscal impact it's going to have until things actually start happening, should this pass. Sorry. Let me see, I think I skipped one by mistake here. Yeah, arguments. So the supporters of this say that the high cost of rent is going to hurt, that this proposition will help seniors and families and people on lower fixed incomes. They are the ones that are most hurt by the high cost of rent. It would let local communities decide what's best for them, whatever their particular housing needs are. And the opponents say that the proposition will reduce the amount of rental property available, and it doesn't encourage more building, which is what is needed to address the lack of affordable housing, and it would create new local bureaucracies. So the financial support, we've got about $20 million in contributions. A lot of it's coming from the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and the rest is coming from various unions. And the opponents, who have raised almost $52 million, those are primarily realtor groups. No surprise on any of that. It's pretty standard. Okay, now we're going to talk about property. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. And in fact, I didn't ask for questions. So if yes vote is made, it will repeal Costa-Hawkins, and it will allow cities and counties to enact rent control ordinances. And the no vote is there's no change to the way it is now. Are there any questions on that one? Okay. All right, Prop 11 has to do with labor law, California labor law, and work breaks for emergency medical personnel. So the situation now, I just would point out that this does not apply to the ambulance employees public ambulance employees who typically work for the fire departments, for example. This applies only to ambulance personnel, emergency service personnel who are employed by private companies. And that's about 75% of the ambulance services in the state. The California counties oversee the local emergency medical services. Private ambulance providers will contract with counties to perform their services in a specific area. And ambulances are geographically positioned around an area, and when one is called to an emergency, the companies have to reposition their other vehicles so that there is coverage, and nobody's all of a sudden going to be left without any coverage. There was a case in 2016, which we'll call the Augustus case. It's the name of the defendant, or the plaintiff, I'm sorry. And the California Supreme Court ruled in that case that it had to do with requiring private security guards to remain on call during rest breaks. And they said this requirement didn't comply with state labor law. Instead, the court said that guards had to be off duty and they can't be interrupted even if there's an emergency. They're not working. And then as a result, the security guards were awarded penalties and damages. So there's a concern that EMS personnel are sort of like private security guards, and it could be that private companies that provide ambulance services would have to change their personnel practices to around breaks. So what this proposition would do, it would amend state labor law as it applies to ambulance personnel, allowing them to remain on call and paid throughout their breaks. It would limit legal liabilities that the service providers might face if the Augustus decision is applied to ambulance personnel. The on-call rules established by this proposition would apply retroactively to any lawsuits that are now pending regarding work breaks. And the measure also requires ambulance providers to offer EMS personnel additional training, education, counseling, and services. The idea there is that some of these personnel have to deal with very traumatic experiences, and some of them may need some counseling and support and specific special training. So if private security, if the Augustus case applies to EMS personnel, the fiscal effects are all calculated on the assumption that it would apply. Prop 11 would relieve providers of the cost of operating more ambulances to cover off-duty breaks, which would be potentially over $100 million annually. Providers that don't offer training and education at the levels that are required in the proposition would have new costs to provide all that training, likely in the low tens of millions of dollars a year. There would be tens of millions in local government net savings due to lower emergency ambulance contract costs. The supporters say that this would establish into law the long-standing industry practice where they pay medical personnel to be on call during their work breaks. And they're saying, of course, it's imperative that these personnel are available to answer emergencies, life-threatening situations. And it also mandates that such personnel receive additional training to meet emergency standards. There were no arguments submitted in opposition to this. The American Medical Response is the company that it's one of the largest providers of in the U.S. of emergency personnel, and they contributed almost $22 million to the Yes on Prop 11 campaign, and there were no contributions from opponents. So this basically puts, it amends the labor clause to allow private ambulance employees to remain and be paid on call during work breaks, which is basically existing practice now. It exempts, but the big thing is it's exempting the employers from liability for violations of existing laws regarding work breaks. And then a no vote means there'd be no changes and the current pending lawsuits would move forward. So obviously this company is trying to make sure it doesn't get sued. Yes?
Do you have any idea what other states do?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry.
They've been required, private companies have been required to not take a break, but just not get paid for it, is that right?
As it is now, the emergency personnel have been taking their breaks and they've been paid, they've been working. You know, they have been getting called during their breaks and they have to drop their sandwiches and they've got to go, okay, during lunch breaks. But apparently the security guards didn't have that same, didn't apply to them. So this is supposed to amend the current labor law so that the emergency services can continue their practice of paying their people and having their people respond during a break. The way the law apparently is written is that it's going to make sure that they're not found in afoul of that law, the current labor law. So it's amending the current labor law. Clear as mud.
And doesn't it take
Really?
any current litigation against those private companies off the books? So if
Yes.
there's litigation against them in the courts now.
That's right. It's gone.
Kicked out.
It's gone. Right. Yeah. You know, it's interesting. You wonder why some of these things come before the voters, but they do. Okay, now we're going to. We're getting close. I'm going to go kind of fast on this one because we're going over time. But the Proposition 12 has to do with housing for some certain farm animals. Another housing proposition here. So you may remember back in 10 years ago, California voters passed a law that would regulate how large the confinement spaces would be for egg-laying hens, for calves that are raised for veal, and for breeding pigs. The law didn't take effect until 2015, even though it was passed in 2008, because it was giving time for the farmers to take care of compliance. But apparently there were problems. There are complaints that the description of the approved confinement space was too vague, and there was lack of clarity about who was supposed to implement and enforce the law. So this proposition attempts to address these concerns in a number of ways. I'm not going to go through this whole thing. They're setting specific standard measurements for egg-laying hens and the veal calves and the breeding pigs by different times. One thing that is interesting is that it bans the sale of eggs and meats from those animals who are raised in areas smaller than what's specified in the proposition. And it also, that applies not only to producers in California, but also to producers in out of state. And then you can see it requires cage-free housing for hens and this would apply to hens and it would require eggs from other states that ship to us to comply with this as well. And then it finally does designate the California Department of Food and Agriculture and the Department of Public Health are responsible for the implementation. So the fiscal impact could potentially decrease state income tax returns or revenues, from farm businesses due to expenses incurred to meet the space requirements. That's probably not more than several $1 million a year. The state would incur costs of up to $10 million a year to enforce the measure. And consumer prices are probably going to go up for eggs, pork, and veal. The supporters of this proposition are mostly Humane Society groups. They want to strengthen and clarify California's current farm animal anti-cruelty law. It would prevent these specific animals from being housed inhumanely, and it would reduce the risk of people being sickened by some diseases that might, like food poisoning or other things that would occur because the animals are overcrowded in too small spaces. Now the opponents are in two groups. One of them is basically farm industry trade associations, and they say that the current guidelines are fine. This interferes with the rights of the producers to run their business, and it will result in higher consumer prices. There are also some animal rights groups who say that they're against it because it doesn't go far enough. Financial support, there's $9.4 million from these organizations here, and then about $500,000 from a group called, mostly, Humane Farming Action Fund. So if you vote for this, you get those changes, and if you vote against it, there's no change to what's happening currently.